Okay, we're on.
Okay, hopefully this presentation thing is going to work out. Okay, can you see the presentation?
Yeah.
It's just the blue
Looks
screen
good.
for now, right?
Yep.
Okay. So I was going to initially start with a rant about Plessner's writing, but Sebastian inspired me to be charitable towards it and to try to give my honest best interpretation of what he is trying to say here. I found it quite difficult going, despite the fact that I had read it before and I dealt with Plessner in my master's thesis. But nonetheless, I do think we have to admit that his analysis, his interpretation of the Cartesian dichotomy is quite original and quite interesting, and he sees certain implications which are often neglected in the treatments of the Cartesian dichotomy. And this is essentially, I think, the point of this chapter. It is trying to see what are the consequences of the Cartesian dichotomy. Where does it lead to this division into mind and body, into res cogitans and res extensa? And more specifically, what does it mean in a methodological sense? What does it mean for the methods of science? And in Plessner's case, most specifically, what does it mean for the methods of his anthropology, for how we approach the study of humans, and also because humans happen to be living beings, how we approach the study of living beings, of life. So to maybe look at what I think what are the main takeaways that I got from this is just to summarize very quickly before I go through it in more in depth. I hope this isn't going to drag on too long, but there is quite a lot of ground to cover. So I think the first point he makes is that we need to keep examining the fundamentalized foundations that we take for granted in our research. In our case, this is the Cartesian dichotomy, that the principles of immanence and the approach of methodological sensualism, which are in a certain sense derived from the Cartesian dichotomy, are quite limiting for studying a variety of phenomena. For example, comparative psychology, comparative biology, trying to study other creatures, other animals. This is just one example, but of course, studying humans as well. It's particularly unsuited for the study of humans, for the study of anthropological, cultural, historical phenomena. And to this, because of this flaw of the fundamentalization of the Cartesian dichotomy, philosophy should, in cooperation with science, study its fundamentality. How founded is this dichotomy really? And it should look for it, or at least that's what Plessner does, in life itself. In other words, what is going to happen in practice is that we are going to analyze the categories or the conditions of life as the feature of bodies that appear in such a dual aspect that eventually gets radicalized into this Cartesian dichotomy as this whole theoretical framework. So yeah, the first point essentially is that foundations which might work for us in everyday life, we might say maybe in more contemporary terms, some kind of heuristics that help us function and accomplish certain tasks, are not necessarily good for science. That is, we take as foundational some kind of ideas, some kind of theories that aren't really all that well founded. And a bigger problem is when this happens in science, when science takes for granted certain theories as foundational and explores a variety of phenomena through these foundations without ever really questioning properly how well-founded are these theories. Are we maybe going too far in applying them to a variety of phenomena without going back and trying to look, are they really well-founded? So as example, Plessner gives a variety of examples from Darwin's theory of evolution, Freud's theory of repression, Marx's theories, as examples of theories which we sort of take for granted without re-examining their own foundations. So how fundamental are they really? And of course, the foundation that we are looking at here is the foundation of the Cartesian dichotomy, which has in essence ruled the philosophy of mind and a whole lot of other philosophies since Descartes made this very, very famous articulation. And so, yeah, what is the Cartesian dichotomy in Plessner's interpretation? I tried to draw a lot of things. I don't know if this is going to help any of you, but in trying to get to Plessner's point, what he's really trying to get to, I tried to kind of visualize his points. And the basic fact of the Cartesian dichotomy, which we're all in a certain sense familiar with, but which is interesting to look at through Plessner's eyes, is this division of things into res extensa on one side, extended kind of thing, and res cogitans on the other side, the thinking kind of thing. And the important thing to note here is that physical bodies, so in a sense, the bodies of nature, physical bodies that we see, are equated with res extensa. So physical bodies are such things that are extended, which means they are also measurable, being extended into space. They are quantifiable, and via them we produce quantities. The best kind of way to study these quantities is, of course, a mathematical, quantitative kind of natural science, which comes to kind of rule our research as the exact proper method to approach nature, to approach physical bodies. On the other hand, we have res cogitans. What is res cogitans? So Plessner introduces this interesting term of interiority as a very Innerlichkeit in German. It's a very broad term to capture all the variety of phenomena which we experience as being on the interior as opposed to the extended matter of the outer world. This realm of the thinking thing, this interiority, is not measurable. It is not quantifiable, and therefore it cannot be studied with a quantitative method. All it produces is a lot of qualities. Now, the problem is that objects, physical objects, nonetheless, in the way they appear to us, seem to appear, we can, on one hand, we can measure them, but also they have certain qualities, a certain whatness in how they appear to us. And the question is, of course, what is the relation between these quantities and these qualities? How come the objects come to appear in these different modes? And what do we do about qualities? How do we study them? We cannot measure them. So the quantitative natural scientific method is not the proper approach to qualities. We can, on one hand, reduce them to quantities, or we can say that qualities are just the products of our interiority. So they're in a completely different kind of realm of experience. A further derivation of the Cartesian dichotomy is derives from the question, so where am I? Where am I as the thing in the self position, located? Clearly, I'm not extended. So in a certain sense, the only place other than the extended world that I can be is in interiority. I am of peace of res cogitans. Now the problem is, not only does the I, the interiority belong, not only does the I belong to this interiority, the interiority also belongs only to the I. It is limited to the confines of the I. How does this come about? Of course, it's via the famous method or move of the Cartesian doubt. I'm doubting, I'm engaging in thinking, and therefore I'm in a certain sense proving res cogitans as far as myself and my doubting is concerned. But of course, from this position, I cannot, from this position is available only to myself, in a turn towards myself as a particular I engaging in doubting and therefore proving myself. I cannot prove the existence of other I's. The interiority which is given to me is only the interiority limited to my I and to the limits of my own I. So we have two ideas here. on the one hand, the I belongs to interiority, and furthermore, the interiority is limited to the I. So in a certain sense, the interiority is subjectified. It is the realm of the subject, and that which is found in this realm appears also to be subjective. So if we had the world of quantities that are the measurements of the res cogitans, here in the realm of res extensum, here in the realm of res cogitans, we have interiority, and here we have qualities, which seem to be, as said, subjective. Now, another chaotic drawing, another attempt to try to make sense of this. The problem is that we have essentially, if we follow this Cartesian dichotomy, we have essentially split the world into two aspects, into a certain outer aspect and an inner aspect. In the outer aspect, we have the extended, measurable outer world, which we access via outer experience. There we find bodies which we can quantitatively, mechanically describe by physics. And on the other hand, we have the interior world of my thinking, which is possible via an inner kind of experience. I can describe this experience, for example, through psychology. But furthermore, there are bodies, as I've said before, also appear in the qualitative sense, in their certain whatness to present themselves to us. So they present themselves not only as systems of quantities, which physics describes, but also as systems of qualities. And these systems of qualities are, as said, situated within this interiority, which I've said already are, of course, being limited to this interiority of the I. The qualities which find themselves in this interiority are also subjective. They're interior, they are subjective. The questions, of course, which arise and which we are all familiar with, are the questions of how to put the two together. Why do objects fall apart into these two different modes? How do we can, in a certain sense, pair the quantities and the qualities? Or as Plessner expresses himself, how do mechanical stimuli and bodily processes in the nerves and the brain impacting on the I bring about the qualitatively shaded image of an object? So this is the aporetic situation we find ourselves in. Why did we find ourselves in this situation? Well, Plessner thinks the key thing is that we have equated physical bodies with extension. We have said that the physical body is something which is extended and therefore measurable. And this essentially gives physical bodies to the sole study of quantitative natural science, and in a certain sense turns nature into a very particular kind of thing to study. It's no longer, we are not strictly studying nature in its whole as of quantities and qualities, but just as nature, as Plessner says, quoting again, nature as the result of natural science, as the product of its methods. So I think an important idea which is underlying this and which goes throughout the work is that we need to broaden the conception of the body, broaden the conception of the physical, to no longer limit it solely to what is quantitatively, what is quantifiable. And as Plessner says, only where philosophy summoned the courage to contest the exclusive relevance of exact methods for gaining knowledge about nature has it been able to find answers to the unsolvable questions of the Cartesian dichotomy. So only it is the task of philosophy to re-examine this Cartesian foundation and try to find a way out of this crossroads, out of this, or even blind alley we have found ourselves in. This is possible today because natural science has, unlike, for example, in the 19th century, where it was still, in certain sense, budding and trying to prove its worth in the face of all the idealism springing up around it. Today, science has proven itself as necessary, as a reliable good approach to study certain phenomena. But it is now time to also, now that its value is clear, it is time that we should also be critical about the assumptions it makes in studying. And Plessner says that today is the time where, in his time, where the slogan "Away from Descartes" will draw a large crowd of supporters from the most diverse branches of organic natural science and so forth, if philosophy could finally decide, as have done a few brave thinkers, to tackle anew this whole complex of problems. And for others who've been part of this reading group and also who are in these fields, I think this is something we can closely relate to. And this is a very strong movement in certain areas of the philosophy, this idea of trying to rethink what Descartes was saying. And for example, in the work of Varela and in the Embodied Mind, for example, there's also this strong push to try to find a way to transcend this strict dichotomy of Descartes. But of course, it's a little more complicated than that, as it goes with Plessner. So more confusing drawings. The question is, how do qualities come to appear in the first place? Or in other words, whence qualities? What is the actual thing that is going on that an object, that a physical object, that a thing of res extensa comes to have this all these qualities? Where are they coming from? Well, Plessner has this. Well, this is something we're going to obviously discuss for a more precise understanding. But it is essentially the result of physical bodies coming into contact with interiority. It is the result of a conjunction of interiority of res cogitans, of the interiority of res cogitans, and res extensa. Physical bodies are given to res cogitans. They appear to it. They break up in its alien medium, as Plessner puts it. And interiority grasps these objects. It makes them into objects in the first place. It objectifies these bodies. The important thing to realize here is that it's not the substantive core, as Plessner puts it, of physical bodies that we come into contact with. That we don't come into contact with the actual being of bodies that appears, but merely their mantle of appearance, an appearance which is external to their being. We see only the front of the body, which stands against us, and this is what Plessner, I think, phrases as that this appearance, this mantle of appearance, is displaced forward from the actual core of the being. All we know about the physical body, in the end, is deduced from, based on this mantle of appearance. We aren't in touch with their actual being. It's just the appearance that we are deducing features of physical bodies from. But in doing so, in this displacement of appearance, what actually also gets displaced forward from the res extensa is res cogitans itself. And I try to sort of compare this to the situation of reading a book. For example, the reader as the one that is doing the reading emerges only from doing the reading with a certain book. It's not enough to just have a book. It's not enough to just have a person. You need to be reading for the book, for that which is read, for the reader in a certain sense to be displaced forward from this act of reading. Now, given the fact that we've said that interiority is in a certain sense limited to these confines of the eye, we can see that the physical body can only become an object insofar as it is in touch with the interiority of the eye. It is only an object if it is present to someone. It can be just some kind of a impersonal thing. Furthermore, Plessner tries to make it, quite pushes this point, that it's not sufficient to have just two kinds of things. It's not sufficient to have the person and the book as two kinds of substances, as two kinds of things, but we need this process in between them, the process of cogitatio, of the process of thinking, which is executed from the center of the I, from the center of the interiority of the I, for this object to really appear. So you can't have just two separate things. You need these things in a certain truly polar opposition, as Plessner puts it. We can't have two spheres facing each other as equals without a direction. There needs to be this strong polar opposition between one and the other. Yeah, maybe to quote just for a moment the way Plessner puts it, as long as interiority and extension in their opposing positions still maintain their common character of being, the requirement of a polar position between them is not actually met. So res cogitans by itself isn't sufficient. Res cogitans needs to engage in thinking. We need this act of the subject. We need the subject to establish a relationship to the thing. And it is only an execution from the center of the subject that really enables the physical body to appear. For the physical body to appear. So on the one hand, the I was displaced, the interiority of the I was displaced forward from interiority's contact with the physical body. But on the other hand, we see that the I already needs to be present for this to be possible. In a certain sense, the I needs to move away from itself towards the physical object, but then it has to return to itself. And this is, in fact, how the I establishes its own identity. And Plessner quotes the Bible here and trying to compare this, that the I has to lose itself to find itself. The consequence of this is that that the I and its acts are, in a certain sense, the condition of the experienceability of the world. The I is the mediator of the physical things and the way they appear to it. And we're going to return to this in a couple slides. So, to summarize some of these points so far, first we have this equation of the physical body with extension and therefore with being measurable, quantifiable. Next, we have this idea of disjunctivity. Extension is radically opposed to interiority, and they only come into contact in a very specific sense of forward displacement, as I've tried to explain it. Furthermore, the I is actually equal only to the interiority is actually only equal to the interiority of the I. And this means that appearance is subjective and that the I, in a certain sense, has been displaced forward from this contact with res extensa. Now, obviously, this is going to mean that the I is quite limited and it can, in a certain sense, never quite reach beyond its own sphere, beyond the sphere of appearances that appears. All of the bodies that we see, we already see as bodies in relation to ourselves. We see them as appearances. We see their essences already essentially modified. We see them in mediated form. We see the world, in other words, in our image. The I has placed itself between itself and the things it is surrounded with. But that means that all we really see is ultimately a content of our consciousness, a content of our I. It is an image. It is a representation. The things that we see merely stand for the things themselves. And this Plessner summarizes as a supposedly so-called famous proposition of immanence, which I'm not quite sure where this phrase specifically originates from. I know Theodor Ziehen, which he quotes on several points, also used a very similar term for this, with the proposition of immanence. But to put it shortly, The position of immanence means that the I can never truly reach beyond its sphere. It may attempt to do so, but it cannot truly accomplish this reaching. And this is essentially what transcendental idealism drives to its final conclusions, as it tries to, in a certain way, save appearance for the purposes of empirical science, for example. It tries to find laws in the I that enable appearance, that make it in a certain way reliable, but in doing so, it actually closes the subject from the world and tears the world into this objective world, the world of objects which are facing the subject, but also the trans-subjective world of the thing in itself facing away from the I. It does so, as Plessner says, only by dint of a crack in the whole of being, which as a sundering chasm creates two experiential positions that are not mutually convertible. But this is not really something that empirical science deals with very much directly. It tries to explain away this problem. It doesn't really face it head on, and tries to hand it over to the philosophers to do their hair splitting. In practice, what natural science does is that it puts its faith into a kind of natural, naive realism of everyday and intuition, where it seems that the I is embedded into comprehensive being just like everything else. The I is in touch with the world, I am in touch with others as well, but the thing is that in doing so, it actually radicalizes this dichotomy without even really being completely being aware of this. Although it embeds both the res cogitans and res extensa in a supposedly the same kind of comprehensive being, as Plessner puts it, it actually treats these two spheres with their own methods and as pure realms of particular kinds of phenomena. It treats the inner world and the outer world as essentially separate worlds. Furthermore, a crucial part played in this is the assumption it makes about the localization of the I within the body, within my body, which will ultimately lead us to have an even stronger division between the subject and the world. Now, we can see here in the center that we have the I. The I is the here. It is the absolute point of convergence of all the phenomena that are appearing, of all the appearances. It is the absolute point of convergence towards which our own body is converging. It is always the here. My personal I can never be here or there. It is always the here. On the other hand, my body can sometimes be there or sometimes be here. It is not this same kind of absolute point of convergence like the I. It can be in the here, but it can never be the here. And the consequence of this convergence of the body around myself as this point of convergence, as this the here, is that it seems as though the body encloses the I, as though I am enclosed within my body. There is also the fact that we experience the body's internal organization. On one hand, how it senses the world, and on the other hand, how it acts upon the world. And last, there's the fact that we can think about ourselves without any sense organs. So the subject can engage in these acts of self-reflection without using his sense organs. Again, increasing this experience of the separation of the subject and the body and the world. These are a variety of factors which lead to this idea of the localization of the I. So what are all the consequences of this? First, we have a very strict segmentation, separation of an inner and an outer world, with our own modes and objects of perception. We can see that outer perception is always really a work of mediation. And we can see that the outer world is actually a kind of derivation of the way physical bodies, the world appears to me. It is not the world itself that I would have direct access to. And if we translate this into more contemporary terms, these are the problems of the existence of the external world and its accessibility, the problems of intersubjectivity, the problems of comparative psychology, being able to compare, to study other psyches, or in particular the psyches of other kinds of beings. There's the problem of the relation of the organism versus his environment. There's the problem of the mind-body connection, and so on and so forth. So we see that empiricism, trying to, in a certain way, sidestep the problems of immanence, has actually made them all the more pertinent. And it particularly runs out of breath when it is trying to deal with phenomena when these problems are even more articulated, such as the study of life, for example, the study of humans. We have entered essentially a world that is a representation of the I, that is no longer offered up on a plate, that we need to get to, that we need to, in a certain sense, construct. We no longer get any data about a world in its originary form, but only mental images, which are barely distinguishable, Plessner says, from mental images which are the products of our fantasies. Nonetheless, our images do have this quality of indication, as though they do in fact indicate something something else, as though they were in fact in contact with some kind of an outer world of things in themselves. The body, in its affinity with the I, seems to be a kind of bridge between the inner and the outer world, something that appears to be on the periphery of our immanence. And this is the positivist take on empiricism, where it takes sensation as this kind of pure boundary, not the work of not located pure in the subject, not located in the world, but as this pure bridge allowing us to source information from the world in the form of sense data, and to construct images based on that. But of course, the problem is that this idea of a very atomistic sensations, which we will supposedly rely upon at this point, is very limited in what kind of phenomena it can capture. It cannot even capture phenomena like Gestalt, certain complexes which emerge from particular bits of sense data, but that pure sense data does not contain. Of course, we also cannot study the psyches of other beings because they are not extended and therefore not sensible with our outer perception. And these are some of the problems we arrive at when it comes to comparative psychology. Can we study other psyches? Can we take a sufficient distance from ourselves, from our humanity, to study other animals? Can we ever not anthropomorphize? Is the study of the psychologies of other animals anything more than metaphorical because of these laws of immanence? Maybe a quote to spice it up: the foreignness of other organisms to the human species makes it doubtful whether the human is capable of distancing himself from his own humanness to the point of being able to avoid all traces of anthropomorphism in his analysis of the psyches of other species. As a consequence, biology took a turn away from trying to study the psyches of animals and to focus on the simple, empirically observable, sensuously observable relationships of stimuli and responses, and essentially reduced its conception of the life plan, of the structure of living things to this relationship. The problem with this approach, of course, is that it discards important questions of things like the relationship of mechanicism, and vitalism, the autonomy of life, essentially everything that is not immediately empirically observable sensuous. So, but what kind of plans should we then look for? Well, what is Plessner trying to get at? What can take the place of these behavioristic kinds of life plans? What Plessner is wondering of whether there are such life plans that are given beforehand, that are a priori in a certain sense, before any kind of empirical sensuous study, organizing ideas that determine the relation of the organism and the environment. Is there, in order to quote him again, is there evidence of such life plan forms or vital categories that are given beforehand primordially with the organism and the environment relative to it, or in other words, that as organizing ideas put their stamp on both zones of existence? In other words, these categories, which he's trying to explore, trying to find out whether they do in fact exist, aren't just some kind of a Kantian category. It is not the work of the subject trying to make sense of this experience, but they reach into the basic levels of existence. They are actually the condition not of our experience, not just of our experience of life, but also conditions of life itself to be life. They are in the very structure of life. And what they in essence do is that they determine the relationship, the concordance, the harmony, the togetherness or lack thereof of the organism and the world. Another way he puts it, they are spheric unities of the subject and his counterworld. So this is these are the kinds of a priori categorical laws or conditions of life that we should focus on. This is what our philosophy of life, of biology, should analyze. And in doing so, this is perhaps a part that we can focus on in discussion, so this doesn't drag on too long. We will discover also that even in the case of other kind of species, other kinds of creatures, we can study things like consciousness. Only we have to rethink our concept of consciousness, to no longer visualize it as some kind of an invisible chamber or sphere within us, or some kind of an entity, but to see it as this basic form and basic prerequisite for the behavior of a self-positioned living being in relation to its surroundings. It's essentially a primordial basic fact of life that we should be able to analyze through the analysis of such vital categories. And this is essentially what philosophy or philosophical anthropology and its embedded philosophy of life should focus on, rather than trying to supplant natural sciences completely from its work. It should cooperate with them. So the question we ultimately arrive at within this context of the exploration of the categories of life is whether we shall find such categories in life that would explain the origin, the source of the Cartesian dichotomy. In other words, what we are trying to find out is whether the Cartesian dichotomy, to return to the first part of the presentation, is as fundamental as it has been interpreted. Is it in a certain way located in life? Is it a part of life? How do we come to this idea of the inner and the outer aspect of phenomena? So we're going to be looking for phenomena, or for more specifically for things, for kinds of bodies that appear in this dual aspect, that are not just of the dual aspect, because, for example, we'll be looking at them, but where this dual aspect of the outer and the inner is the basic part of their being. And the kind of thing that is supposed that Plessner suggests at this point, but hasn't yet very strictly proven, appears in this dual aspect is, of course, life, because life has its own world in addition to occupying it. Life doesn't just belong to being, but has its being. It has a world with and against which it lives. Life is both an I and a physical thing. And now, of course, our starting point in this exploration is that we know we are such an I with our interiority and an outer world in the relation to which we are through the medium of appearances. But of course, it is the tendency of the human, Plessner says, to quote again, to be on a first-name basis with our surroundings and to seek what we are in the reflection of the world. So, in experiencing ourselves as this kind of dually aspective I, we also start to see other humans as such dually aspective beings, and also all other animals ultimately. But we have to be careful here, Plessner warns us, not to extend this dual aspectivity of outer and inner that got radicalized into the Cartesian dichotomy to everything uncritically. We have to first find out whether this dichotomy, whether this dual aspectivity is really something fundamental to life. And we have to do this in particular because of cultural historical phenomena, which don't break up nicely according to this Cartesian dichotomy. They're not just physical, they're not just mental, they seem to be in this weird place weird place between nature and culture, between extension and interiority. Consequently, we can't treat cultural historical phenomena as just psychophysical conglomerates, some kind of things pieced together, but as their own original entities which resist breaking up according to the dichotomy. So we have to avoid this, because the consequence of applying the Cartesian dichotomy to phenomena of culture, to essentially to anthropological phenomena, leads us to a human which, under the dualism of two essentially different methods, threaten to disintegrate into two beings. And the goal of philosophical anthropology is to establish this a more unified view of the human. And this philosophical anthropology, of course, has very little to do with empirical studies like studying the reaction times of particular tribesmen and islanders. That is not what it is interested in, and it also does not rely just on pure experience, because Plessner wants to find out the starting points of experience, the a priori conditions of experience. Nor is this a matter of metaphysical speculation about dualism, because what he's trying to find out is if these dichotomies necessarily emerge in the first place. And to summarize, these are the goals of philosophical anthropology, not a naturalist reduction of humans to physical characteristics. It is an approach that is modeled more according to the humanities, because it tries to take a more a priori method of trying to find the categories that enable the phenomena which we are going to study, and it should let, or so Plessner says, he wants to let the concepts and the categories and the objects of study develop, reveal themselves through exploration rather than being defined strictly beforehand. This is essentially the task of the philosophical anthropology, and in doing so, it will, of course, as we've seen, have to return to nature, to life, rather than just give up the study of nature and life to natural science. It should return there, because there, Plessner believes, it will find the roots of this Cartesian dichotomy, or at least a better understanding of it. It is not trying to get rid of the Cartesian dichotomy, but to try to see why, how it appears, and whether it is fundamental. Why? Because there can, to quote again, be no concrete philosophy of nature as long as the dogmatic or methodological anthropocentrism remains valid, it brings about the dichotomy between the physical perspective and the consciousness perspective, just as this dichotomy brings about anthropocentrism. So these are some of the ideas. This is Plessner's interpretation of the consequences of the Cartesian dichotomy. And on the other hand, we have an early methodological guideline, which he is going to develop in more detail in the next chapter, where we are really going to get into the nitty-gritty of this question of things appearing in the dual perspective being called living things. And now we can turn to the discussion.
Okay, thanks, Primož, for the presentation. I think that all the main topics were basically covered. So well done. It was definitely not the easiest chapter. And also, I would just like to maybe point out that this chapter and the one before, so the idea was to just kind of go through them a bit more quickly, in the sense of having just one session dedicated to them, because Plessner from the next chapter onwards really starts working on his approach and developing his ideas. We'll have always every chapter split in two parts. So, you know, we'll have first half and then the second half next week. So it's easier in that we have more time to discuss things properly. With this chapter and the former one, where he kind of builds up slowly and tries to just present the framework, that the idea was precisely to just, you know, kind of go through the main points, and so that we know where we're at. Anyway, any questions, comments, what have you? I'll be the moderator again. It would seem that this is my designated role.
Well, I guess I will just maybe open this for as a warm-up before we get into the nitty-gritty of the content. I think we should touch on this question. Is it necessary to write in the way Plessner writes? Is he efficient in getting his ideas across, or is he making a real mess of, for example, introducing interiority, and then sometimes he uses the term, sometimes he doesn't use the term, and it's never quite clear what exactly he's pointing towards. For example, he says the psyche and the res cogitans are not the same, but they both point to interiority, but then never really explicates what exactly does this mean. And I feel like it is something to be discussed. Should we indulge these German philosophers in their habits of trying to get philosophy across, or could these ideas be expressed in a clearer form?
I think that's a really great question. Thank you for your presentation too. I just you make me think of something that I think Plessner is unusual as a philosopher in that he rewards study both at sort of the sentence and paragraph level and at the sort of very large argumentative strategy level. But sometimes the mid-level it's harder to read him productively at the mid-level, because it seems like he's not being organized in the way that he's presenting things, the way that he's arguing, the way he's using terms. So for me, sort of repeatedly appealing both to, well, often appealing to that sort of higher level of what is his overall strategy is very helpful for sorting out some of his organizational difficulties. If I can just tack on one more thing here about this chapter in terms of that organization, well, maybe I'll put it this way. If you were to summarize what you think Plessner is doing, you know, what's his main aim here in about a paragraph? What really have we come away with after finishing this chapter? What would you say?
That's like an open question, or is this aimed at Primož?
Well, yeah, it's an open question. I figured it'd be interesting to sort of, I mean, it'd be interesting to hear, is it Primoz?
Primoz. Yeah.
Primoz, yeah, maybe Primoz, maybe that would be a nice kind of addendum to the rest of his presentation if he sort of just were to summarize it verbally in a paragraph.
Yeah, I think you made very good points here, because I very much relate to Plessner on this meta level, on the structure of the whole world. I very much sympathize with the ideas he's developing. And also I can see this when you go through sentence by sentence, there are really fascinating insights, and you focus on one paragraph and you really see there's so much going under there. It's sometimes not clear how do we the exact path he's taking. It's not clear where he's going. He's going through this very thick swamp, this forest, and just counts on us to be hyper smart and just follow all the different things he's also assuming and not really explaining in a certain way. But I would say, I think this chapter can very easily be banalized into the simple statement that the Cartesian dichotomy, which equates physical bodies with extension, is unsuited and too limited for the study of living phenomena, and particularly anthropological phenomena. And I think that's the basic message and the most important thing to get from this chapter. From my point of view. But maybe someone else can also give his slug line of this chapter.
No, I think that's great. And I have almost nothing else to say about chapter, so I'll just tack on this little bit to that. I think I would agree with you 100%. And as I read it, I think there are really three main moves and three main parts of the chapter. There's this kind of catalog of all the problems with the Cartesian dichotomy, which is the first, 20 pages of the chapter or more. And then, incidentally, I often think that's very similar to another very famous text in philosophy, which is Gilbert Ryle's chapter on the ghost in the machine and the concept of mind from 1949. It's a lot of the same criticisms. It's sort of a collection of all of the problems with Cartesian dualism. Problem of other minds, problem of the reality, the external world, problem of mind-body interaction. But then the other two main points are made in the last two sections of the chapter. So one is about the kind of adjusted framework that's necessary for making sense of living things, to sort of put this idea of vital categories of the life plan at the empirical level, and then vital categories at the philosophical level as the foundation that allows us to get beyond the Cartesian dualism or the Cartesian dichotomy as a foundation, as you usefully highlighted, for understanding living things and metaphysics and so on. And then the second, the sort of last point of the chapter, I think, is in the last section, and that's again reminding us of the anthropological significance of this, that what we find out about life in this way has to have an effect on how we understand ourselves, because we are living things. So we're looking forward to the anthropological implications of this. And so that's about all the insight I have. So I'll be quiet now and just listen to the discussion.
Philip, can I just say something about the style?
Sure.
Or would you like to add something to this, and then I can get back to the style thing? It's also okay.
All right, which Philip are you asking? I think I would like you.
I'm asking you, Philip, because you raised your hand.
Oh, I was raising it about another question, but I'd like to hear you say something about the style yourself.
So yeah, I will
I'm not
probably
alone
be
in having
defending an unpopular position here, but so I think that there are two questions here. Does he have to write like this? I would say no, but the fact is that he is, and that there are reasons for this. That's one thing. And with regards to these reasons, I would like to point out two things. One thing is that I see that people who are not used to this type of writing make a very common mistake, the one that you presented in your email. Namely, they take one sentence and then they try to really split it up in the sense of trying to find a true meaning. Whereas with these particular writings, you gain way more if you zoom out. So zooming out instead of focusing in is a better approach. So zooming out in the sense of holding the context of the chapter and the book and the background horizon in which this text was written. Now, this is something I said before already. It's basically an acquired skill in a certain sense to be able to read these texts. And once you actually get into them, you start enjoying them, and it's not as difficult anymore. The thing is that we're not used to these types of texts anymore. But back then, people were writing in this way, and these cross references and this way of presenting arguments and presenting ideas and developing them were pretty normal. Although admittedly, Plessner is, still believed by many that he's very dense at certain points. But the point I'm trying to make is that it is not as difficult once you get into the habit of writing and thinking at that particular time. So, the problems I have with these types of questions is, what exactly is the point of these questions? Because the style of writing that we have now is also founded on so many implicit practices and things that you're simply used to. Sure, this is a normal way of expressing things to you in this particular context, but is it necessarily clearer and better and more profound? I don't necessarily think so. So
I agree about the bound of profundity, that it's not necessary. If you write very clearly, it's not necessary, or sometimes it's almost the rule that you're not that profound. But I think it boils down to a very simple question: are you writing with the reader in mind? Are you trying to guide the reader through your ideas? And I think this is a quality that a good philosopher, a good writer, not necessarily a philosopher, but a good writer should have, to be able to really get the reader to get what you're saying, rather than essentially unloading this whole mess of ideas which make sense in your head, and then putting them on the pages and hoping that someone is going to be used enough to the way you think and to the tradition in which you think to be able to piece it apart and put it back together.
He had a reader in mind, just not the same reader as a contemporary writer has in mind. I heard a comparison between the mathematical textbooks in the States and in Russia. So in the States, you would have, you start from the very beginnings, you have this thick textbook, and start from the very beginning, and then you build your way up to the polynomials. And then with Russians, you'll have, imagine a polynomial of the third order. That is the beginning of the textbook. And they also have a reader in mind, but it's contextual, again, in a certain sense of why would it be that this particular way of watering down everything to being accessible to, I don't know, a semi-retarded someone who might happen to pick up this book, be a way to communicate with the reader? It depends, again, who your reader is. So I think that Plessner did have a reader in mind, but he had his colleagues in mind. He didn't have a layman necessarily. And even if he had a layman, the level of the capacity to read these types of books was way higher. And the reason why it was the way higher is because it was expected that if you want to understand these books, you will have to work hard to be able to understand them.
Just for comparison, Plato, being the father of philosophy, I think he is in most works incredibly clear, and he wrote the dialogues with the idea of being able to communicate certain philosophical insights to his interlocutors, to his readers. And does that really diminish the profundity of his work? And why should modern philosophers not kind of take a lesson from that? If some of the greatest philosophers could have expressed themselves in a relatively clear, and I don't mean this in some kind of very narrow analytic sense of clarity, but in a relatively clear way that aroused understanding in the reader and in the community he was addressing, why should Plessner, just because he is this heir of a particular, I think, mostly German tradition of a kind of writing, be exempt from this this decorum? I think this common decency towards the writer. That's.
I'm sorry, I can't. I know we got people with hands up, but I'm burning here in my chair. My mind has been changed by Sebastian. What can you think of any examples of writers from this time period that write clearly in the sense that you mean?
You asking me or Sebastian?
Yeah, because I just think it's actually a non-issue. It's simply about the time period. Like you can say Heidegger's an unclear writer, you can say Cassirer is an unclear writer, like you can say any of these people are unclear writers, but it just has to do with not being from their time and not knowing their terminology. Like, you know, Bertrand Russell was a clear writer, but we're just like not that interested in what he had to say. Like it's not part of the same conversations. So I just think it's kind of a non-issue. I think it's solely a matter of temporal, like historical distance, is my sense. And the personalities of different philosophers, like, you know, Heidegger has his style, Plessner has his style. You can talk about ways that Plessner's style is, you know, is peculiar, you know, that he uses, like you pointed out, I think this is accurate. He doesn't use the same word repeatedly, consistently. He sort of shifts his terminology. It's not always clear whether he's actually shifting to a different technical term or he's using a different term to refer to the same thing. That's frustrating. I think that happens a lot. And that's different from what Heidegger does or what, you know, other authors do. Anyway, be quiet. That's my challenge. Who writes clearly in this time period?
Matt said that William James writes clearly at this particular period, and that's a good example. But anyway, Philip or Chris, who would like to?
Yeah, if Chris wants to follow up on the question of style.
No, Phil, go ahead, please.
But Chris, you wanted to say something about style. I saw you nodding.
I was going to say, I don't agree with the William James. I just want to point out that clarity in philosophy is sometimes used polemically, and my example is the 30-year discussion between Joe Agassi and Karl Popper on clarity and meaning in philosophy, where Popper and Agassi both are polemically insistent that they write clearly. But if you look at Popper's manuscripts, Popper revised constantly, just constantly. And there are alternate versions of everything he wrote. And Popper is oftentimes held himself up as a model of clarity. And particularly once he starts getting into evolutionary epistemology, this becomes intensely problematic. Joe Agassi is the same way, where he says everything I say is clear, and I say no, it is not. No, it isn't. So I think, you know, thinking about clarity in philosophy is I think a very complex issue. I do agree with Phil H, because it is a product of the time period. I agree with you, Seb, that the audiences of this text are very different. I think, you know, a model for you know, Bruno Bauch might be a model for clarity around this time period, but there are other problems with Bauch's philosophy. But I think it's a good question. One of the things that I wanted to bring up that I think we're losing a little bit here too is that Plessner in this chapter makes a point about disciplines. So, and I think that's the other argument in the chapter that we might be missing a little bit. So he basically says that there is a really problematic dichotomy between sort of the consciousness historical disciplines and the natural science disciplines, and that the focus of the chapter needs to be not only that the Cartesian dichotomy is a dichotomy which is which is significant and needs to be addressed, but this is also a problem among disciplines.
Okay, before we comment that, I think that Philip asked.
Yeah, I was actually going to raise a little bit of different kinds of questions that maybe can open up. And
yeah,
first of all, in a certain sense of a partial defense of Descartes, I mean, one of the questions that I don't think is really being addressed here is the fact that Descartes was having to deal with a very different theory of perception. Once you have the physiological understanding of how the eye works, it's casting an image on the back of the retina upside down, and yet you're having to relate that to the phenomenon of seeing. Seems to me you have an interesting question that has to be dealt with. And I don't know if Plessner is really dealing with the question of what kind of theory of perception would we need to have, in fact, his own account of the world taken care of. I've been thinking of a comment by Robert Sokolowski in his work, The Phenomenology of the Human Person, where he says, we have to think about the question of lensing rather than watching movies or the kind of image perception. And I thought there was something interesting in that. Is there some way in which we need to work that particular question out? Now, I happen to think that Husserl is a much clearer writer on some of these questions in the period, but I may be prejudiced here. But it seems to me there's another question that comes up that I don't see him addressing that might be of some importance. He never raises the question of intentionality. It seems to me that's a very important question in dealing with the question of how the mind relates to the world that Husserl and his tradition has worked out. And I don't know if it's going to come up later in the book, but I do think that could be a rather interesting way in which what are the intentionalities that may deal with the world in terms of scientific terms or deal with the world in terms of humanistic terms. And I think that that relates to a certain dynamism of the conscious self. And I don't see anything like this in Plessner. Maybe I'm just missing something, but he never raises that question, which I think is so fundamental to the phenomenological movement. But maybe someone else can comment on it. First, the theory of perception, I think, needs some more attention. And secondly, whatever happens to the questions of intentionality.
Okay, any comments on that? Would anyone like to, either on Philip's
I would
question?
just maybe add that in general, he doesn't really deal with cognition per se much in the rest of the book. He doesn't really try to lay out some kinds of the functions of cognition, of its intentionality. It's not really his primary interest. I had this problem because in my thesis, I was comparing Varela inactivism and out-of-poetic theory with Plessner, and there they deal with cognition quite directly. But Plessner never really gets to it. It's like he assumes a certain understanding of cognition from these all these theories which he is an heir to, from Kant to Husserl, but he's not really so much interested in that specific aspect of humans. He's just looking at humans as a much broader whole, living whole.
One further thing that I would like to point out here is that Plessner actually thinks that a lot of the footwork has already been done by him in his previous work, and he already kind of presupposes that we know this. So the Einheit der Sinne is a book that, from what I've been able to gather so far, that is quite, in many regards, quite similar to what Merleau-Ponty was doing in Phenomenology of Perception. So there he actually starts from what he calls the human experience, so the experience of the human, and then starts to develop his aesthesiology, as he calls it. So that might be a somewhat more, let's say, phenomenological inquiry. And the reason why in this particular book he's trying to not engage in this is because, as he says at one point, the best way to corroborate the findings of your previous research is if you're able to show that they hold true by adopting a completely different method. And in this particular book, he's trying to do precisely that. So he's trying to, that's the reason why, as you might have noticed, he constantly emphasizes that we must not only start with scientific experience, but with experience in general. So he is in principle trying to steer clear from what might be seen as a more, say, phenomenological attitude or phenomenological approach. And this is also why he's kind of constantly emphasizing this neutrality of his approach, and trying to approach the person from the perspective that would emphasize the object, as he puts it, and build the problem from there. So it's a way more object-oriented approach in general, and one that does not want to be phenomenological in the sense of, let's start with experience and try to see how we can get maybe certain correlational laws there. So I think that the previous book, which is significantly less well known, of course, might be of interest in that regard. And maybe Philip H. might say a bit more on this if he knows about this stuff, if you know about this stuff, Philip.
Unfortunately, I don't know very much about it. I've struggled with that text. I mean, tried to read it in German. It's kind of a mess. But actually, it's a mess. My reading of it. I'm just not anything about the text itself. One dimension that is interesting in Einheit der Sinne, though, is this attempt to kind of link human sensory modalities or analyze human sensory modalities through looking at their developed cultural forms. So he looks at geometry and music. He looks at sort of what you might think of as like high cultural artifacts that rely on these sensory modalities as a way of getting at their capabilities or their functioning. And I think there's also a dimension of what he does in Einheit der Sinne that, like what he's doing in Die Stufen, is trying to get beyond the kind of Cartesian alternative, trying to get beyond a framework that classifies sensation, for instance, in terms of an external world that's unknown and an internal world that is supposedly representational of that external world as some kind of mirror or mapping of it, and rather take a much more kind of ecological approach to perception. I think there's a dimension of that. Yeah, so just a few comments on that. I mean, about intentionality, I want to follow up with Phil S, the other Phil, and ask what aspect of intentionality he thinks is missing here. Because, I think in a way the whole chapter is about, by being about the relation between subjects and objects, isn't the whole, within a Cartesian framework, isn't the whole chapter about intentionality? Like, doesn't intentionality fall within the same Cartesian framework that Plessner is analyzing? When he talks, for instance, about the forward, what's translated as forward displacement of the self, which may not be the best translation, I think, for that. It's Vorverlagerung. I have to speak with the translators. But anyway, Vorverlagerung, which is something like, I tend to think of it as like prior placement, or the, I don't know, maybe, yeah, it's a hard one to translate, but like placing before. Anyway, doesn't that kind of capture to some extent this idea that the subject or consciousness, or the res cogitans is bound up with whatever objects it perceives, that it's present or that it's operative in conjunction with any appearing of objects or any presencing of objects.
Which is sort of, in the Husserlian terms, the noesis noemata relationship, or in some ways you're talking about there. Yeah, that's what I was sort of beginning to see, but I just couldn't see it. And I think you're focusing on that particular term was one which was intriguing. I was interested to know how that was really playing out. So yeah, maybe it's there, it's just subliminally. I just didn't ever see the terms being used in quite the way I was thinking of those. And that's part of my own translational problem, but not good. Thank you.
My sense is that the phenomenological tradition is a bit ambiguous about the metaphysics around intentionality. Like, they would like to sort of, maybe they're trying to do something similar to Plessner. They're trying to sort of cut through a metaphysical problem by just describing a structure, a structural relation. So, because the other part of intentionality is that there's no subjective perception. There are no subjects without objects.
That's right. That's right.
In a way, it's sort of collecting some insights from Kant's transcendental deduction, like about the sort of mutual constitution of subjects and objects, or their mutual dependence. Yeah. So maybe there's a similar ambition with intentionality, as sort of cutting through the Gordian knot of the metaphysical problem of Cartesian dualism by just starting from a structure that involves a relation between those things.
Good. Yeah.
I would just like to add something with regards to what I said, that just to exemplify how maybe, zooming out, instead of focusing in can be beneficial. So for instance, I think that Primož did a marvelous job in leading us through the whole section. But you can make also different emphases about what's being done. And for instance, one of the things that Plessner does is he emphasizes this distinction between understanding Cartesian dualism ontologically and methodologically, because many people would say, sure, like what you read in these primary texts, in textbooks, sure, nobody believes in Cartesian dualism anymore, right? Because it's superseded. We all know that there are no such things as two things or whatnot. But if you consider this from a methodological perspective, and by this Plessner means how you basically approach a certain domain or realm, how you approach a physical thing or a physical aspect, or how you approach a mental thing and a mental aspect, then all of a sudden this becomes extremely pertinent, because this is something that has been then transmitted up till now. You still have this idea of mentality as something that is self-posited, in the sense of, something that is given in a more direct manner than that other thing which is given via measuring or something like that. And in this regard, he's basically trying to show how the internal logics, this is what I found very interesting. And this is so to make maybe Matt a bit more interested in this particular move. It's a very Hegelian move in a certain sense. What Plessner is trying to do, he's trying to show that there is an internal logics in Cartesian way of approaching things, which has its first explication, which is what Descartes did, and then it simply unfolded, this logic unfolded progressively in the direction where we ended up with this internality, where not only do you have a dualism, but you actually end up with a very radical form of subjectivism, where you are somehow excluded from objectivism. So there's like an internal logics that has been unfolded in the history of, among other things, German philosophy. And what he's doing, he's basically debating his idealist colleagues. He's debating the tradition in which he was, brought up. So when he's talking about how you end up with this principle of immanence, he's basically using a Fichtean argument to show how you end up in a very radical form of subjectivism if you start with Cartesian presuppositions. Even though you might say, I'm not a Cartesian, I'm transcending Cartesian, what Descartes was trying to do, but you are still following the logics of the thinking, because you're simply saying, I don't believe that there are two substances. This is bollocks, this is naive. Sure, but you're still operating in the methodological framework of what was opened up there. So, you can read like 20 or 30 pages and you can say, he's basically repeating a lot of stuff. And you can read it from the level of the argument, but you can also read it as implicit and explicit counter arguments to the positions that he was surrounded by. This is why he constantly emphasizes contemporary philosophy not only has to go back to the object, but even has the guts and the means to do so now. In the past, they tried to do so, but they were unable to. But now we can do it. Again, it is an implicit or explicit reference, depending on how much you know about the background developments, to these philosophers that were still somehow, kind of caught up in some version of idealism, either explicitly or implicitly, as he would claim, for instance, for Heidegger. So this is just, a concrete example of what I meant by why it really pays off if you zoom out. And the more you know about this horizon and the background in which he was operating, the clearer become some of his writings. All of a sudden, something that might be obscure has a lot more sustenance to it, and a lot more depth to it. Not in the sense of being, deep in the sense, but more. There's a thickness to it. Yeah, a thickness to it that is more pronounced. Anyway, yeah.
Sebastian, maybe we should see if anybody else who hasn't spoken yet has some comments
sure.
or questions.
Well, I can chime in here. I think, Sebastian, what you were saying brings me back to Philip Sloan's point about the importance of perception here. And after Descartes, even those who claim to overcome him were still playing within the same, playing the same game. There was sort of a turn to the subject, and the subject's relationship to the object was construed in terms of representation, and perception was construed in terms of representation of something beyond the subject. We don't know exactly what it is. Descartes felt he had it pinned down as mere extension or measurability, but for Kant, it's the thing in itself. Whatever it is out there, it becomes represented in mental terms through this process of perception. And I think in order to extricate ourselves from idealism, perception is the place to zero in and to come up with a conception of perception that doesn't require representation. The inactivists do some work on this. Whitehead, of course, comes up with prehension, which is an account of perception not in terms of mental representation, but in terms of causal efficacy, right? Rather than causation being a category, as it is in the Kantian tradition, it becomes a more of a felt. It's given an account in experiential terms through prehension, right? And the whole vector of experience is reversed. Rather than the subject constructing objects, the objects grow together into a subject in Whitehead's way of looking at it. But so I think I'm curious to see how Plessner tries to crawl his way out of the idealist enclosure. So, just to throw those ideas out there, I think zeroing in on how we account for perception is the key to escaping the Cartesian dichotomy.
Very good. Very good. Yeah, just to interject one simple point, just to follow up. I think I can clearly see where he wants to get, and I actually am very favorable to where he wants to get. I just want to see exactly how he's going to get there. And I think that the question that was just raised by Matt Siegel was very good. Is that at some point it may really require a deeper analysis of what is the nature of perception and how we can, in fact, overcome that dualism by some other richer notion. You're referring to Whitehead, which is interesting to see here. But I think that's an important problem, but I'm glad you raised it in that way. Yeah.
I may share with you one moment I had when I was reading this regarding the notion of Innerlichkeit, interiorness or interiority. Because what he says is that he wants to replace the talk about psyche and or consciousness by the notion of interiority, I think he's using. And I was, it really reminded me, Merleau-Ponty, of course, with in his late book, he speaks about, he doesn't speak about consciousness, he starts speaking about the invisible. So he starts kind of shifting the vocabulary. He's using different metaphor, different kind of group of metaphors. And I was thinking, well, if we start speaking about interiority, it is, this is a topological metaphor. And by shifting from psyche to topological metaphor, we are already kind of making the psyche more worldly. So we are somewhat on the way to overcoming a dualism or complete opposition between something like two substances or something like that. Of course, this is also in the context of the idealism. So perhaps this is blind alley, or how to call it. But I wanted to share this small observation with you, and perhaps some of you may explain to me whether he keeps using this later, or is this just a blind alley for him? How do you feel about this change of the metaphor, of the language, of the metaphors used? I was quite struck by that.
Well, that's a good point. I haven't thought of that, I have to admit. Yeah, but he, as far as I can remember, maybe Primož and Philip H. can say something about this, because I know they've read the whole book. But I don't think that he cashes in on any of this. I think that this is basically this Innerlichkeit for him is he then, you know, basically goes down the road of having the methodological aspect where you know, you have this self-positioning and self-givenness of a certain something, and this is the more important aspect. So he doesn't play on the potential of the changing of the images, of bringing forth a grounding potential grounding of the subjectivity or mentality or what have you. And I think that but again, I'm not sure, because I have, you know, I wasn't paying attention to that particular point, so I can't really remember if he does use it later on. It's definitely not central, and even about that I'm not 100% sure. So again, maybe Philip H. and Primož can remember.
John, would you just quickly rephrase or repose the question, if you don't mind?
I felt like by starting to use the term or the notion of Innerlichkeit, the interiorness, instead of psyche or consciousness, he is putting the res cogitans at the same space as the res extensa, because this is a topological metaphor. So I felt like, wow, he is making the psyche more, he's bringing it into the world by using a spatial language, okay? Because if we start thinking about the body as the inside of an outside, you know, we are kind of having one dimension or one perspective on both the res cogitans and the res extensa. And of course, the problem is to overcome the dualism. So this would be a way. But maybe my reading is too much Merleau-Pontian, because this is, you know, I read it through the conceptual couple, the visible of the invisible. Merleau-Ponty starts speaking, instead of the consciousness, he starts speaking of the invisible. And the invisible is always related to a visible, right? So the psyche is not outside of the world, but it is the other side of a body, etc. Something like that. I made it more complicated.
No, yeah, that's a good. But I'll just very quickly add something. He will go in this direction, but not by that, following that particular metaphor, as far as I can remember. But he will definitely, as you've already seen towards the end of this particular chapter, he talks about, you know, how important it is to allow for the space, so allow for the dimensions that are not given in sensual intuition, but still are crucial for the structuration or the formation of that particular intuition. So something that is intuitive but not sensual, or something that is non-sensual. And these would be the invisible aspects. You know, like the life plan that Primož mentioned, and that is a reference to Uexküll's biology. So life plan is not given when you're looking at, say, an animal chasing its prey. You do not see a life plan, but it manifests itself as this circular interrelationship between the animal and its milieu. So you have the invisible that is actualized somehow. And for Uexküll, this is a very Kantian conception. So there is like a thing in itself where there is a life plan. You know, that's pretty much the Uexküllian notion. But as Plessner points out, other authors, such as, for example, Köhler, eventually moved away from that Kantian aspect. And he and Dilthey, at least he feels like a strong affinity to that. And then this would be very close to Merleau-Ponty, are trying to use this Uexküllian notion without necessarily having to talk about something that is invisible in the Kantian sense of a thing in itself, where you have to speculate about the reality in itself?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think there are maybe a lot of different forms of the non-visible, non-spatial, non-intuited and non-spatially located. There's this distinction between the space-like and the spatial, which comes up again and again later on, which is interesting. So it's almost like there's sort of a second level of spatiality that's being introduced. That's not normal physical spatiality. I think the passages you're referring to, just briefly, he's kind of criticizing an error, but it's a mix between criticizing an error and talking about the source of a kind of intuitive experience of things. He thinks it's sort of on the one hand, like saying literally the res cogitans is inside the body can't be right, particularly in terms of the kind of logic of the Cartesian framework, the way that those terms are defined, that can't be right. But that sort of scientists and philosophers thinking about it subsequent, coming after Descartes, sort of couldn't help but think of it that way for various reasons. And there's this passage I referred to in the chat, pages 49 to 50, I believe. There are two paragraphs that come through, I think, as Plessner's own view about how perception works and why. He gives a kind of anthropological explanation as to why we locate ourselves inside our bodies. We locate our mentality inside our bodies, but it's not fully adequate, right? It's not a fully adequate approach to embodiment, to the mind, to the way that those things are going to relate. And he's going to come back to that stuff later. Eccentricity is going to be kind of the linchpin of understanding how mind and body relate ultimately for human beings. But yeah, looking forward to getting into that. I can't help but notice, and I feel a little ashamed to say it, but I can't help but notice that none of the female participants have made a single comment. So I wonder if we could encourage that, because men just will talk and talk and talk and not let women talk. So. Are there any questions or comments? Maybe can I ask that? Is that fair, Sebastian?
Yeah, for sure. Sure. Let's just hope you haven't put them on the spot now.
Yeah, if I have, I apologize. I mean, I don't want to do any harm, of course.
No, it was a nice
anything.
gesture, I think, Philip, actually. So yeah, we'll see what the end result will be. If not, you'll have to come up with a really cool question.
No, I think I'm done. I have no further questions or comments.
So, Eva, Susanna.
I still have to catch up.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
What?
I still have to catch up with understanding a lot of things. So yeah, for now, I just keep listening. I'll try to participate more in the next sessions.
The thing with Plessner is, in fact, I think that upon reading him for the first time, it really is to know where the heck he's heading and what he's up to. So, for instance, Philip, you and I and pretty much we have read the whole thing through, maybe more than once. So once you do that, it's way easier. But the first time around is just, especially when you end up in like chapter 2 or something like this particular chapter, you can follow along, but you don't really know what the heck are these things happening. So where is this going? Pretty much you wanted to maybe.
Yeah, I sort of have this experience that the first reading, I just had no idea what he was going on about. I had some basic interpretation of him from Boro to Schley, and I sort of got that. Then the second and third reading, I sort of started getting it, and now I think I'm losing it again. The fourth reading is I'm starting to zoom in into the particulars. And I'm thinking, okay, but what does this really mean? How does this connect into the whole? And I feel like there's this process, you come to understand him better, and then again you come to understand him less, because he seems so much seems to be going on, and so many of these threads which are connected from chapter 2, for example, to the later chapters, when he actually deals with the human, who is the most relevant to all these discussions of the Cartesian dichotomy. And these things are supposed to connect, but I can't really quite piece together how they connect. And I've already forgotten everything he says in the later chapters.
Same experience with Merleau-Ponty, Whitehead, right? But anyway, Matt, you wrote something very interesting in the chat. Maybe you could either read it or sum it up, because I would be interested in what you mean by that, and in what way you think that Plessner might benefit from Whitehead.
Well, Philip H. was kind enough to direct me to the pages of this chapter where Plessner does discuss perception, and I was just looking over that and seeing my notes in the margins, and Primož indicates that in chapter 6 he'll go more into depth, so I'm eager to see that. But you know, it reminded me of Whitehead's critique of what he calls the sensationalist school of philosophy, which is this focus on the sense organs, the outward-facing senses, as though that they were the primary source of information from the outside world, rather than what he calls bodily reception, as opposed to sense perception. And so the feelings of the viscera is how Whitehead would phrase it. And this is connected to his account of causal efficacy and prehension, right, as a non-representational form of perception. And it just struck me that we'll see where Plessner goes later in this book when he gets into more depth, but he was, you know, mostly talking about sensation in these pages, page 50, 49 and 50 and 53, and there wasn't much of an account of anything like what I take Whitehead to be referring to when he discusses bodily reception. And I think when we look at the phenomenological tradition, the focus is on consciousness. Yeah. And for Whitehead, most of our experience is not conscious. And indeed, our experience of causality is not conscious. I think we have to say we can cultivate a sort of a form of experience that is reaching for the peripheries of consciousness, on the edges of consciousness, and the liminality of consciousness. But it's, I think, you know, I don't want to go too deeply into this Whiteheadian critique of what's missing in the intentional structure, you know, that Husserl and the phenomenological tradition brings out. But I'll return to this point as we move forward, just to see how Plessner addresses it, and to what extent Whitehead's view here remains relevant. But I wanted to throw it in the mix.
Good.
One point here that I would like to maybe add, it's also a bit of a repetition. So maybe this is somewhat helpful. So from Plessner's perspective, his account of, say, experience and perception in the broader sense of the term has been already somehow established in the sense of what a true nature, that's not the right way of phrasing it, but what the proper way of thinking about perception and lived experience is. This is something that was worked out in the unity of the senses. And here he basically posits, from what I understand, precisely that if you want to understand perception and lived experience in general, you know, just falling back to trying to reduce everything to sensations is wrong, ultimately wrong. You have to allow for other dimensions of intuition, and even for non-intuition. And basically, this is something that he's trying to establish. So what he's trying to do now is, you know, he's basically repeating some of the stuff that he's done and trying to show that even if you don't start from that particular point of view, although he's kind of presupposing it and bringing it in to debate the idealist colleagues, his idealist colleagues, you can still start from the object, finding an object where you have almost a concrete counterexample of Descartes, and see where that takes you. So, and living beings will be precisely that. So the phenomena of living are phenomena where you have this dual aspect, as something that is inherent, or that is characteristic for their mode of being. So he wants to start from there and think about this phenomenon and figure out what might be the categories that might underpin this dual aspect. So as Primož said, he doesn't want to say, look, this is just a mirage. There is no duality. There is no dual aspect. What he's trying to show is simply, it is not fundamental. There is a dual aspect, but it's not fundamental in the sense as Descartes thought it might be. And if we start from the living beings, from living things, which exhibit par excellence dual aspectivity, and we show which categories can account for this, and basically it will be about one category, which is the border, then you can actually approach a whole lot of philosophical problems from a completely new angle. So a whole new field opens up in a certain sense. And you can do this either in this particular way, starting from an object, or you can do it from more classically phenomenological way, where you go, well, what is the nature of perceptual experience? So I think that that's the reason why this emphasis is not as pronounced. Yeah, I see a lot of things are also happening in in the chat. So yeah, any comments on this or any questions about something else? It's a very rich chapter, so a lot of stuff to go.
Well, perhaps something we could maybe touch upon is this point, which is the way he puts it about cultural historical phenomena, which I think is an aspect of Plessner which we have to maintain in our sights rather than focusing maybe just on some kind of a philosophy of life. It is anthropology and culture which he is heading towards ultimately. And it's this idea that cultural historical phenomena are not things which we can understand as psychophysical conglomerates. So they can be thought of as just physical or just mental, or not, nor can they be thought of as some kind of a mixture just of these two, but they have to be thought of as original entities. And I wonder maybe if someone has some idea what of the meaning of this, of what this might entail. What would it mean in practice, for example, to find an example of some kind of cultural phenomenon and try to show how, in what sense does it fail to break up according to the Cartesian dichotomy? I think this would be very welcome if Plessner had done this in a more explicit sense. So this here we have this cultural phenomenon, and here is how it cannot break down into according to the Cartesian dichotomy. Maybe if this is a thematic area, but someone else is interested in.
Unfortunately, as much as I'm eager to continue participating in this conversation, which has really heated up in the last couple of minutes in terms of my own interests, I need to run to a faculty meeting, so I look forward to continuing next time.
Lovely, man.
Thanks,
enjoy
everyone.
your faculty meeting. Yeah.
I'll try.
Okay.
All right.
Bye, man.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining us. Would somebody else want to have a go at this? Because this is something that relates to our previous chapter, the one that I was presenting. So I can also say something, but maybe if anyone else has any thoughts on this before I start.
I just want to say thank you I think it's clarified, at least for me, particularly that very fine presentation of Primo's, both some of the fundamental nuggets in this chapter, and I think I've come through with a much clearer understanding, and I've really appreciated this discussion. So I just want to say that before we go into seeing what we did before, but go ahead, please.
Yeah, well, basically, we've lost another one, I see. Well, maybe we can wrap up in the next 10 minutes or so that we're not too late. But the thing that in the previous chapter, what he was saying is that within the Kantian tradition itself, a problem arose, namely, if you follow, say, the distinction that was initiated by Descartes and then somehow fully developed by Kant, where the domain of knowledge is something that pertains only to the physical objects and how they interrelate. So basically to say natural phenomena understood in a very specific way, then you basically cannot have a Wissenschaft, that is to say a science of cultural phenomena. And people found that more and more problematic because eventually methods were developed, like historical critical methods, which show that you could basically approach cultural phenomena in an empirical fashion, although using different methods, but still in a systematic and rigorous way. So within the humanities and social sciences themselves, there was an issue, like there was a problem, clear, a conceptual problem emerged because sciences themselves started to show, look, we can study things like states, political institutions, and what have you, and we can study them empirically, and we don't have to reduce them to just an interplay of physical things that are causally interrelated. So philosophers, what are you going to do about this? Clearly, there's a problem. So this is something that, for instance, started to cause a lot of problems within the Kantian tradition. So we had all these different schools that were developing. But this is also something that Plessner plays at. So he's showing that, you know, humanities and cultural sciences have shown that this is the problem with phenomena, that the cultural phenomena basically are, in a certain sense, concrete counterexamples of this Cartesian dualism. But now he's trying to make the whole picture unified, because if you say cultural phenomena are problematic, but there you have natural phenomena that somehow still fit into this category, then you have still some sort of a strange dualistic picture, which he doesn't really want to have. So he says, just like when we started to approach cultural phenomena concretely, as he puts it, so we need to approach natural phenomena concretely. That is to say, we need a concrete philosophy of nature and a concrete philosophy of life. So in a certain sense, he's saying philosophers have to reclaim the phenomena of nature and life again. So these must not be relegated solely to the purview of natural sciences. This is somehow the line of thinking. I hope that this was helpful.
Yeah, but because I find the idea of this original kind of entity very fascinating. For example, if you take a sculpture, which is kind of a work of culture, a work of art, it as a physical body, it's just a piece of rock formed in some particular, seemingly arbitrary manner. But then, as humans start to shape it, as it becomes a piece of art, as it starts to get treated as a piece of art, it attains this whole new reality, which can be reduced to just saying, oh, it's just a part of our culture, because it is reliant on it being a physical body, and yet as a physical body, it is not really. Its essence is not really in it being a physical body, nor is it in being a piece of a cultural product. It's caught in this, and not necessarily cultural product. It's not a psychical product. It's not just some kind of idea I have about it. It transcends both the physical body and as well as the psyche, and lives in this its own sphere, as Plessner says, yes, as an original entity, and as he will develop later in this realm of the spirit of humanity in a certain sense, which is really, again, beyond this dichotomous view. I think this is an interesting way to look at all kinds of cultural phenomena, because we have a lot of, especially in this current era, a lot of issues about the conflict between cultural phenomena, which are conflict between the nature and the culture, between what the physical nature of something is and what what humans as psychological eccentric beings contribute to this object. And Plessner might be a very good way to see that we cannot just say, oh, like the evolutionary psychologists, this is just nature, this has just evolved. But we cannot, neither can we deny the physical nature or the physical origins of certain phenomena. So, yeah, maybe.
Timmy, you have a background in arts. Maybe do you have any thoughts on this?
I mean, I was thinking about it. Yeah, I mean, not really regarding Plessner's position, because I'm so it's still very foreign to me. So I have trouble grasping his positions at this point. So, but what you were saying, Primož, yeah, that's a very, I mean, it's a really interesting problem. I see like maybe a lot of correspondences between this, what I think, how I see Plessner at this moment, and let's say some discussions within the let's say extended mind literature, and like especially what's called participatory sense making, right? When you have like a, I don't know, I mean, if you take Plessner as a kind of as a thinker who tries to ground human cognition or psyche on some sort of biological principles, right? And then the question becomes, okay, so how, what does how do we account for like the cultural collective aspect of human spirit, cognition, what have you, right? So this is the problem becomes, I mean, the social becomes a crucial issue for like let's say a biologically grounded anthropology, right? Because if you take like a biologically, I think the crucial problem with any kind of biological approach to the human is that it individualizes the human as a kind of an individual organism. Like the principles of his cognition are usually framed in terms of his individual, let's say, maneuvering through its environment, its individual interest, and so forth, right? So this is, I guess, the problem with which I see in, like this is a very interesting topic for me, especially when it comes to arts, because I do appreciate very much the importance of taking biology and nature into account in all this. Yet, like the usual way we still go about this in the, let's say, a kind of a Darwinistic psychology sort of way is completely repulsive to me. And not repulsive in a sense, it's just, it sounds so shallow and banal, usually when you try to account for like, yes, so we like, people like savannas more than they like mountains because our evolutionary history originates in Africa. Like, it seems like complete bullshit to me. I don't know, I mean, someone could confront me on that, but like, I see this as a completely misguided approach where you take like some evolutionary principles and you try to integrate them into like individual aspects of cognition, right? So where I would see, so this is something like where I see collective participatory sense making as a much better approach. When you say no, the biological aspect which we are exploring is precisely the kind of the levels of plasticity and intermeshing of individuality, which is possible already on a biological level for the human. This is the interesting part for me. And this is where you could like integrate many of cultural phenomena and cast a very fresh and interesting light to, I guess, questions of art. Practices which seem like they don't have any kind of biological grounding, in the sense that our practices, our values seem to be completely underdetermined by our individual biological needs, yet they still seem very important to us. They have a very important place in our society, and a kind of visceral importance for us individually, like a visceral importance that seems natural, seems, yeah, not, I wouldn't say natural, but it seems biologically driven, let's say. So yeah, that would be like, I'll stop my rambling here.
It was a
This
good
alley
round,
of the comparison between participatory sense making and Plessner, I think, is potentially very productive. I think his idea of the spirit could very much be construed in terms of participatory sense making. When this human spiritual world takes a weight of its own and essentially starts to kind of guide our lives, it becomes a precondition of our leading our human lives. Yeah, I guess we've ran too late now.
No, I think that this is okay, and it was it's a good topic. Actually, leads a lot of possibilities for further discussion. So it's a pity, in a certain sense, that we've touched upon it now only. But we will get back to it, because when we get to the human, I think that just very briefly. So 2 points here, I think. One is that the notion of biologicals, as you will see, Timotei, is like very, very different in a certain sense. And when you come to the human, the logics that he's developing precisely leads into this specific characteristic of humanness, which is its eccentricity, which in a certain sense is fundamentally and in principle social, almost, precisely because of this incapacity of being self-enclosed in a categorical manner, and precisely because, as he says, the nature of human is to be artificial. So there's like this artificiality, which is the naturality of human. So I think that these aspects will be cool to you, something that will appeal to you. This is also something that I was referring to at our previous discussion, that I thought it would be of most interest to you. So, and I would just like to add something, and then we can wrap this up, I think. I just realized, as you were saying this, I mean, it's a pretty banal statement, and I'm guessing everybody here will agree with this, but what enormous impoverishment it was for biology, where it basically kind of decided that it will allow the evolutionary theory to just kind of delineate its outlines. You know, I mean, it was extremely useful, and nobody would deny this. It's a very useful, but the very fact, with all the knowledge that we had about the temporality of theories and everything, just holding on to this one particular articulation of this, what enormous impoverished, in my view, of the field that actually tackles with life, you know, with the phenomena of life. And I'm not trying to either mysticize or anything, you know, here necessarily with relation to life, but just this closure of the openness. And of course, I understand why this is useful, and on many different levels, from the epistemic to the very pragmatic and social. You need grants, you need departments, you need people who research stuff, and they need to know what they want to research, and you need to be able to present things in a way that, you know, you sound like you know what you're talking about, and then you have a certain framework that you do it. So I'm not trying to belittle this, but just this sense of impoverishment. Yeah, this is something. Yeah, maybe we can.
I just wanted to add that one of the main things I took away from Plessner was that I felt like I got a little bit closer to life, something which I had not experienced, for example, with Varela and Enactivism, which seemed a lot more formal and kind of a little mechanical, whereas Plessner really, in the way he approaches the explanations of the categories of life, and the way he explains how a plant functions, how an animal functions, you feel like you get a lot closer to what it is to be alive based on a comparison with your own experience as a living thing, then you get with this distanced evolutionary perspective of some scientists looking from without and trying to draw lines between certain types of environments and certain kinds of creature. And I think this is a great feature of Plessner.
Yeah. Okay, maybe we can wrap this up here, unless anybody would like to say anything related to that. If not, I'll be seeing you, I think it's in 2 weeks, right? Or 1 week? 2 weeks. So next week, we don't have anything next week. So yeah, in 2 weeks, And Jan, if you have time, maybe we can have like a very short 15-minute talk about the other stuff.
You mean now or?
No, maybe unless you want to do it now, if it would be easier for you.
Maybe, well, yeah, we can talk a bit.
Okay, maybe 10 minutes. Okay.
Okay.
Okay, then I'll stop recording.